for this event. All right, well, let me start quickly by introducing myself. So I am Victoria Bilk. My pronouns are she, her. Please forgive my spooky Halloween lighting, but I'm on the Northeast and lost power and went on a mad dash trying to find a house with power this morning. So all good to go. I'm the program director for digital safety and free expression at PEN America. We are a nonprofit that celebrates and defends the written word in the US and internationally. And I run our online abuse defense program, which my colleague is going to drop a link to in the chat if you'd like to learn more about it, because I don't want to take up time on that now. We see online abuse as a direct and pressing threat to free expression that is often deliberately deployed to intimidate, discredit, and silence people. It is a major press freedom issue as well. We know it's a pervasive problem in the US and around the world, but the fact is that not everyone is equally impacted. People are targeted for their profession and they are targeted for their identity, especially writers, journalists, artists, and activists who identify as LGBTQ, as people of color, as women, as religious and ethnic minorities. So PEN America, GLAAD, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists, and the Trans Journalists Association joined forces together to organize this three-part series this fall focused on LGBTQ digital safety. And today's absolutely fantastic panel discussion is the first in that series. I am going to hand over in just a minute to our fearless moderator, Jenny Olson, the director of GLAAD's social media safety program. But before I do want to say something that I think is very important. I want to establish some ground rules for today's session. What we want is to foster a constructive and meaningful dialogue, and we warmly welcome a diversity of viewpoints and ideas. But the foundation of constructive dialogue is mutual respect and good faith. And so we will not tolerate harassment and abuse because we actually know that those tactics are deliberately used to chill free speech rather than actually encourage it. We welcome you to engage in conversation in the chat. Please, if you have questions, use the Q&A feature, not the chat, just so it's easier for us to keep track, because we will make time at the end for questions. And we warmly thank all of you for treating one another with courtesy and respect, and remembering that we are all human beings and deserve to be treated well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn off my camera and I'm going to hand over to Jenny and our marvelous panelists.
Thanks, Victoria. And thanks to PEN America and the NLGJA and TJA. Super excited to do this panel today. I'm Jenny Olson, director of the GLAAD's social media safety program. I lead our work on tech and platform accountability. And GLAAD is a LGBTQ media advocacy organization. We work on public campaigns and work with news outlets, TV, film, video games, Spanish language outlets, and social media to tell stories and consult on LGBTQ representation. And so in my work doing LGBTQ advocacy around social media safety, we put together this panel today. And welcome to our panel. And I'll just do a little brief round of introductions and we'll jump right in. Super excited today to have Evan Greer, director of the amazing organization Fight for the Future, as well as fabulous indie punk musician. Sharif Durhams is the managing editor of the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina, and is also the national board president of NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists. Welcome, Sharif. We have Lee Honeywell, the co-founder and CEO of Tall Poppy, and also Social Media Safety Index advisor. Welcome, Lee. And Kat Lowe, who's a content moderation lead at Medan and is a research affiliate at UC Irvine's Steckler Center for Responsible, Ethical, and Accessible Technology. Welcome, Kat. So just a little, framework. So we know that online abuse disproportionately impacts LGBTQ writers and creators and activists. And we also know how hard it can be to navigate that and what to do when such abuse occurs. So I just want to jump right in. And I also want to say we're going to have 2 more sessions in November where we'll also dig in, have like some kind of real hands-on work. And I hope people will join us for those. But so Lee, can you talk a little bit about your work at Tall Poppy and about kind of defining some of this stuff? I mean, a lot of what you do in your work is about preventing online abuse and then also mitigating it when it happens. And I mean, there's so many examples, but can you talk about a couple of things, kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, for sure. So I think most folks on the webinar are probably familiar with the sort of basic kinds of online abuse, things like hateful messages, slurs, threats, other kinds of like we call it keyboard cowboy stuff, where it's people like being aggressive on the internet, but it's just speech, right? My work tends to focus on the ways that those sort of threats and nasty messages escalate. And so I'll talk about a couple of the ways that we've seen that kind of behavior escalate in a number of the situations, both that I've worked on directly and that have, folks are familiar with from the sort of broader ecosystem. One of the most common ways that we see online abuse escalate is something called doxing. This is the non-consensual sharing of personal information. Typically, this is things like people's home addresses, their phone numbers, social security numbers in the States, or other identifying information around the world. Doxing as an issue is exacerbated by the lack of strong privacy laws in the States. Most other countries in the world have some sort of law in place that means you can't just like publish the entire country's home addresses online. Unfortunately, the US does not. So we tend to see that a lot of people's personal information is pretty easy to find. So bad actors, when they want to take their abusive behavior to the next level, they'll often engage in some Google stalking of their targets and republish and amplify information about people's like physical location and other sorts of personally identifiable information. This often extends to people's family members. These like creepy people search websites often have like who else lives at your address, who you might be related to, other sorts of creepy identifying information like that. From a proactive side, it is possible, thankfully, to remove one's data from most of these sites. A couple of exceptions are things like property registries in a number of states and election-related, either voter registration databases or electoral donation databases. It's not very obvious when you make a donation on one of the various like payment portals like ActBlue, or perhaps someone here has used WinRed, which is the Republican equivalent, but seems less likely. But that information that you put into the ActBlue portal is actually public. It's published in the FEC records that electoral parties have to submit. So I'm going way off on a tangent about doxing, but doxing, major issue. You can take steps to protect yourself from it, but it's something to sort of be aware of. Another big thing that we deal with both on the prevention side and on an incident response basis is account hacking. There's not a lot that an individual can do to stop people from yelling at them on Twitter or whatever, but in terms of keeping your account safe from attacks, when people say that their accounts have been hacked, what this usually means is that there was password reuse going on. Maybe you used the same password on like bobspetfood.com as you did on Gmail, and Bob had terrible security on his pet food site, and that account got like accessed, and reusing that same password across your different accounts. So using unique passwords, super important. One of the other sort of more subtle forms of escalation that we see in a lot of particularly LGBT focused online harassment is targeted reporting. So this is using sort of weaponizing the terms of services of various different online platforms to say, like, go through someone's entire Twitter history looking for keywords, and then playing a sort of game of gotcha where you say, oh, I found this tweet where like Kat said, go step on a Lego. That's a threat of violence. I'm going to, like, she said it in 2007, but I'm going to get my like dozens and dozens of friends to report this as like a threat of violence, even though it's from like 14 years ago and is only sort of colorable as a threat. Anyway, so that kind of malicious reporting is something we see really, really weaponized against LGBTQ folks. Yeah.
And then like that would cause your account to get taken down? Or
yeah, it could potentially get your account taken down. You may just have to respond to the individual piece of content, and whether that's like delete that old tweet about stepping on Legos. But it does actually, in some cases, lead to account suspensions. And all of the different platforms have sort of a like 3 strikes or different levels of numbers of strikes before your account is like permanently suspended. And that's not always super obvious to the user, like how much of a problem is this going to be? I'm thinking of a friend who had a failed startup, and somebody reported a very, very ancient tweet of his as like, I forget, it was some very like subtle dig at the fact that his startup had failed. And he was like, I could just delete the tweet, but is that going to put like a strike against my account? And there's this sort of uncertainty and fear around like, what are these rules that are in the background that if I do delete this tweet or I, don't appeal this report, is that going to lead to my account being suspended in the future? So I think folks have a lot of uncertainty around the sort of like trust and safety practices of these platforms.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for the, a few examples. And so let's talk, let's hear from the panelists about, examples of it, to the extent that you're comfortable talking about your experiences with online abuse, either as a target or as a witness, or, and I guess maybe Sharif, could we start with you and then go around?
Sure, I can weigh in a little bit. And as you mentioned, I have these dual role as president of NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists, and managing my own newsroom since the beginning of the year. And so, I've gotten kind of typical harassment that anyone in the public is going to get, but not anything that has escalated. But I have had to deal with colleagues, particularly just, women in general are face this abuse all the time. And it does escalate so quickly. And I will say about the news organization that I work for, McClatchy is a 150-year-old organization, but it is also a 1-year-old organization, after having come out of its bankruptcy as kind of a new entity. So right now it is key to have editors support for reporters who deal with this harassment, and editors taking charge and taking responsibility for reporting harassment. That is not something that should be left on the shoulders of reporters to have to deal with when they're dealing with everything else. And so when instances have come up in my newsroom, it has been a discussion between me and the direct editor of who can take this on and take as much of it out of the reporter's hands as possible so that they don't have to have the additional burden of acting as an independent actor in these situations. I will also say, as in many ways, 1-year-old organization, McClatchy has started employee resource groups and has given a lot of support to its LGBTQ plus employee resource group. But that group is at the beginning of discussions with human resources about getting more permanent resources, getting an organization to contact when there are cases of harassment. Larger newsrooms that I've worked for, national, international newsrooms, kind of already have these organizations on call. I don't know that there is enough discussion in those newsrooms of, yes, we actually have firms that we work with all the time that deal with this harassment, and you should report every single email that you get to help create a paper trail. Report everything to the experts who can help decide, do we as a security firm need to make a phone call to someone? Do we as a security firm need to collect information about this email so that when law enforcement gets involved, we already have the expertise and know the information that they need? So those are things that I immediately think about in terms of supporting people, letting them know to report every single thing, talking in meetings about, I want to be, as a manager, aware of everything, even if I don't act on it in that moment. So that when there is a pattern, I know how to escalate, I know how to yell for resources.
That's great. I think that it's so important. And actually, on that note, if I can just maybe Lee or even Victoria might jump back in, but in terms of reporting or resources in reporting, are there things, concrete recommendations? Lee, do you have any wisdom to share?
I mean, so I'm definitely biased because this is like what my organization does. But I think that I just wanted to really call back to a specific thing Sharif said, which is that organizations, news organizations need to be very, very clear that they stand behind their journalists and reporters when they come under threat. It is night and day the difference in terms of the internal experience of a journalist facing online harassment, whose newsroom is saying like, hey, we've got your back, we're going to provide services, we're going to provide security support, and we're going to make a public statement in support of you, versus like, oh, this is your problem, like you can handle it, maybe just take a break from Twitter, right? And because the external parties will see that statement of support and say, oh, we're gonna like stop razzing this person because their newsroom isn't gonna like go and fire them based on our harassment, right? Versus a newsroom that's just sort of blasé about it. That is visible from the outside. And to a dedicated harasser who's targeting an individual journalist, that is like a sign of their success. So I think it's so important to have that sort of institutional support and institutional care for people that are dealing with harassment situations related to their work.
Thanks, Lee. And I see that Victoria just dropped in the chat the link to the Penn online harassment field manual for best practices for employers and the abuse defense training program, and then a link for Tall Poppy, Lee's organization. This is so good. This is, I mean, I think, for people to feel like, yes, there are things that you can do. Is so important. Evan and Kat, do you want to chime in on the topic? Either of you.
I suppose like what I think is interesting are the challenges, because I work with a lot of independent creators and journalists and freelancers. And I think a lot of organizations don't necessarily know or prioritize protecting the freelancers that they're working with, specifically because they kind of operate outside of the organizational scope. And so what I think is really important, and what I really appreciate about PEN America, of course, is what does it look like to build community resources and community support around like, good security practices, escalation, and even this kind of like standing behind each other, especially when individuals standing behind each other sometimes means that you put a target on your back as well. So I mean, I would like to see, and I think a lot about, how do organizations even proactively reassure and work with freelancers who come to them just like for a few pieces, because I do think that there is a sense of precarity, financially. In a lot of ways, there's a sense of precarity with freelancers, and this maybe even at the bottom of the list, because sometimes you're just trying to make a living. So I think that organizational support is something I think about a lot, and something that I really want to advocate for, because when you don't have like a lot to stand on in terms of advocating for yourself with an organization, having your security and dealing with harassment is something that you can't really necessarily express even.
Thanks, Kat. Evan, do you have examples of things that you've experienced that you would want to talk about, or?
I'm happy to join in. I mean, as like a trans woman who's the primary spokesperson for a national organization that doesn't work on LGBT issues and is often talking to broad audiences, including sometimes like lots of libertarians and stuff, that I obviously experienced this quite a bit. But I would say I really appreciate that we're not drawing what I think is often distinction here between digital security and harassment. For me, get yelled at on Twitter and gendered and whatever all day. And like, I personally, have like the support networks in my life that like that doesn't really bother me. But the things that have really freaked out me and my family and my organization have been more along the lines of what Lee was describing of like coordinated attempts. Fight for the Future was the target of a sustained paid or coordinated phishing attack, for example, that we now have some evidence to suggest likely funded by the tele industry, right? It's an example of like not mean people on the internet, but actually like a paid for coordinated harassment campaign that attempted to break into my email. And that's something that you can't fight kind of more reporting tools. That's something that basically is rooted in basically they never succeed because Fight for the Future has and always has had in our employee book, like you basically can't you can't our online office having two-factor authenticate that up on all of your for example. And so I think not leaving it up to individuals to take those precautions, but baking that into your organizational practices can make a huge difference, so that you're not just sort of having your more tech savvy employees are safe, whereas your less tech savvy employees are really struggling. Someone's saying it's an echo. Is my mic really terrible?
Yeah, it seems like you're having a double audio or.
And see how this does. Let me know if this is better. But quickly, I'll just say also that I also really appreciated what Lee was saying, because I think it runs counter to how a lot of mainstream narratives about how we deal with online harassment are presented. I think we're often kind of sold the idea that like what we need is for platforms to remove more content faster, and to build in basically like more ways for people to report content and then have that content removed more quickly. And I think Lee is pointing out the ways that online harassment often or those types of reporting mechanisms can often be weaponized and used to silence the voices of marginalized people. And I just think that that's so important, because sometimes I am worried about sharing my own stories of how I've been harassed online because of the political climate that we're in, and where I know that story could be taken by a politician and used to push for legislation banning online anonymity, for example, which would make myself and many other people much less safe rather than more safe. So forgive me for veering into policy and away from my personal experience, but obviously that's kind of where my work is rooted. And but I guess the last thing I'll say is that I will say that personally, the worst online harassment that I have experienced is not from the MAGA right, but from TERFs and from people who claim to be leftists, and particularly around being trans, more so than any other issue that I've worked on. The worst kind of hate mobbing has always been around that. So just share that.
Thanks, Evan. And thanks. I mean, a couple things to say there, like, thank you for veering into the policy land. And it is so important to be thinking about the multiple aspects. Yeah, I mean, the volume and quantity and intensity of anti-trans hate these days is so horrifying, and is one of the main things that we're working on at GLAAD every single day. So yeah, and with what you were saying about freelancers, I think is so important, and it is also why it's so important that like organizations like PEN America have resources for individual journalists. And with one of my hats in my life, I have been a queer film critic. And a couple of years ago, I did a very glowing review of a film called Adam that was controversial, and was attacked as and I was like, what? I'm just a film critic, like, and it was terrible. And it felt really helpless to be attacked, particularly on Twitter, and not know what to do about it. So yeah, knowing that there are organizations that are there as resources and that, have your back. And so on that topic, let's just talk a little bit about, and maybe Kat and Evan, we can start with you and then everyone else can chime in. So for all of us, writers, creators, activists, and really just anyone on social media, dealing with, particularly with kind of public trolling, there is this kind of common wisdom of don't feed the trolls. And there's a really great, is it the Center for Digital, what are they called? It's really
Center
great.
for Countering Digital Hate.
Yes, Center for Countering Digital Hate. There's a really great little publication they have called Don't Feed the Trolls. But like, can you guys talk about this? Like, what does this mean? Should we just ignore online harassment and hate, or, what are your experiences? And yeah, I guess Kat or Evan, do you want to start, and others can chime in?
I'm happy to start. I think what I would say is I think this point of advice comes from a good place, and like often it is the correct advice, or like it can be good advice for your mental health, for example. But I think it tends to also sort of reframe what I believe is a collective and societal and policy and tech design based problem into like a problem of individual choices, right? And like you can choose to, and like I myself sometimes choose to feed the trolls and like just, waste 3 hours of my life on Twitter arguing with people. And like sometimes that's actually better for my mental health than ignoring them. Like I can get a little fired up about it, and like sometimes it's fun. Sometimes that's a bad decision. But whether my individual choice about that thing is not going to make this problem worse or make it go away, in terms of the broader sense. And so I think like don't feed the trolls as a mantra for how we deal with online harassment is woefully insufficient. And that's why, again, I'm always sort of pulled into like, let's talk about policy, let's talk about technology interventions, and let's talk about ones that are not based in more automated censorship or using AI to moderate people's speech. Let's talk about ways that we can put power back in the hands of individuals and collectives, ways that we can support each other. I've always been really inspired by the work that HeartMob does, of just like creating networks where you can kind of like hit a button and let a bunch of other people know that you're being harassed, and then like those people can go argue with the trolls instead of you. Which can be, again, doesn't solve the problem, but perhaps can be really helpful to you in that specific moment. And so I think, we need to think about this as something that, there's more nuance, or there's perhaps more interesting types of interventions beyond just let's make it easier to report, or let's make it, let's demand that platforms remove things that have been reported more quickly. There's a lot of things kind of outside of that rubric that I think can make a real difference here.
Yeah, no, I'm 100% on board with that. And I actually think the don't feed the trolls almost implies that if you do react, it like you're naive or something. It's like, oh, well, the typical internet advice is don't feed the trolls, and wow, look at you if you're doing it. And I think, yeah, I agree. It reminds me of actually like arguments around climate change, where it's like, well, take out your recycling, and that'll make a big difference. But no, I think it is sort of this more of a monolith of an issue when it comes to handling trolls as a concept. I don't know, like in the broader sense. But yeah, individually, I guess I like to think about how does one reclaim autonomy, or how do communities retain autonomy in the absence, or as we're figuring out what to have, what to happen on the platform side. So I guess the things that we're talking about right now is like fluency in security tools, fluency in knowing how to navigate like muting, blocking, reporting, and other kinds of tools in order to like kind of cultivate an environment for yourself online where you can reasonably protect your mental health. And like with the HeartMob kind of sentiment, where you can kind of rally people to support you, because earlier I mentioned that with freelancers or with individual creators, if you get a couple of creators to come support you, it can put a target on their back. So, what are those mechanisms? What are the kinds of community, collective action that we can mobilize to make it so if 50 people are supporting you, it's much harder for like all 50 people to have the targets on their back, because the dedicated trolls, there might be 100 of them, and it's very easy. Well, obviously it depends on the situation, but in many cases it's 100 dedicated people. And if they have to divide their time between 50 people supporting you, that's much more difficult than like 2 or 3 prominent people supporting you. So what I think is important is like, how do we create, from our side, those structures that means that we can feel more empowered to speak out. And what is that collective action? The development of like norms and fluency within these communities, like, hey, do you have your 2-factor, like, telling your friends, you do have your 2-factor authentication on, right? And stuff like that. I think all of those things are really, really important in order to, go ahead and feed the trolls and feel good about it, or not feel awful about it.
I think something worth tossing in for reporters working at mainstream news organizations that, I can't remember the phrase, but like, this way lies dragons. I think it's very important to think of your audience, and your audience isn't the troll, right? Your audience is the people who are engaging with the beat that you have, or see you as a subject matter expert, and to think of your responses in terms of what serves you, what serves your career, what serves the organization that you may work for, if that is in line with what you're trying to do with your career. The trolls will be happy to draw you into situations in which you're not an opinionated journalist and you express an opinion that requires your bosses to jump in. That's a perfect solution for them, right? So when you are responding, you need to be conscious of what response gets you the reaction that you want from your audience. Your response may not be an opinionated response, but may lead to other people defending you, right? And so you need to be tactical in terms of how you respond in order to get the outcomes you want. And the short-term outcome you want may be burning the troll, but that may counter your long-term goals. So just be conscious of that. Have conversations with your bosses about it. And if your trolls are effective and consistent, then put that responsibility or at least partner with the organization you're working for in terms of what that response should be. So for instance, if a reporter comes to me and says, this is the message that is getting out about me as an individual reporter and about our reporting because these trolls are saying X or Y. If I work with that reporter in shaping a response, or I work with our social teams in terms of the news organization making a response, then I can defend that. I can go to my bosses and say, I made that call. If an individual is making that response without that consultation, it may be a response that I can't defend. So having those conversations is incredibly important.
I think the 2 things that come to mind for me around the don't feed the trolls question, one of them is, and a couple of folks have touched on this, sort of like, who is your audience? Remembering who that audience is and speaking to them. You're not going to convince Tucker Carlson's followers of anything, and so it's like, it's not worth engaging with that audience. But in speaking to your own audience, I think one of the important like technical notes is be conscious of whether or not you're sort of giving algorithmic juice to your trolls, to your haters. One of the very few sort of prescriptive recommendations we make to the folks that we work with around like how to respond to specific, like to harassment in the general case, is screenshots are better than quote tweeting. Specifically on Twitter, you're able to engage with hateful or abusive content using a screenshot, and you can use the alt text functionality in Twitter so that it's even readable by folks using screen readers, but you're not giving algorithmic juice to the person who you're dunking on, right? Whereas if you are using the quote tweet functionality, you are boosting their content and making the algorithm like it more in various ways. So from a super tactical perspective, like that's one of the things I like to bring up is like, you don't want to be giving your audience to some jerk. The other, and I think Kat talked a little bit about this in terms of preserving your own sort of mental health in relation to online engagement. I'll post a link to my like write-up of this piece of old internet culture, but there's a piece of old internet culture called Charles's Rules of Argument that comes from like ancient Usenet history. But it's basically a sort of rubric for how to get in arguments on the internet while being maximally effective and preserving your sanity. And it's basically engage once, wait for people to misinterpret what you say, clarify, and then peace out. And in terms of like that clarification speaking to your audience, not your the person you're arguing with's audience. So I think that's like it's been a very helpful rubric for me in terms of when I engage online. So I'll share my blog post about it in the chat as well.
Thanks, Lee. That's great. I mean, those kinds of concrete resources are so helpful and so valuable. I think one of the things in the Center for Countering Digital Hate thing about the trolls is this idea that what you were saying about, you know, kind of Tucker Carlson, that so much trolling is, well, disingenuous, you know, that it isn't that they're actually interested in having a real discussion about any given topic, but that it's just that they are provoking. And if the reason for the wisdom of don't feed the trolls is if you engage, essentially you are, you know, giving them what they want and they have, you know, won. And so that idea of like, make the statement, clarify and let go, or you know, anyway, but like, thanks for the concreteness too, the thing about the screenshot. I love that. Anyway, I have experienced these kinds of things over the years, and it is a really helpless, it can be a very helpless feeling. A recent thing that happened, I guess it was in June, the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus had a thing on YouTube, a song that they did on YouTube that they got attacked by just tons of right-wing folks, and the chorus members were getting doxxed, and just it was horrible, really horrible. And the chorus reached out to GLAAD actually, and we do have direct contact with YouTube, and we were able to, you know, reach out to actual people at YouTube and say like, this is happening, and you know, help mitigate some of it. And there are some organizations that are a resource like that, particularly internationally. Access Now has like a helpline, and anyway, those kinds of things where, because that is one of the other things, is you feel so helpless in terms of what kind of resources the platforms provide or don't provide. Let's see here. Did anyone else have follow-up comments on this?
I guess one thing is, I was talking to a journalist the other day about this, where a lot of the goal of trolls is to like waste your time. And so just like, what does it, and I guess everybody is kind of talking about like how to be just strategic or tactical about it. So, you know, I often hear like, yeah, pick a thread, or not a troll, but, you know, somebody arguing with you that you think, okay, if I respond to them, that's going to kind of demonstrate my point, or it's going to be that, it's going to be my argument to all of those trolls. So I don't, you know, have these like a lot of little arguments with a lot of people, but I'm responding to this very specific thread that then if people are going to troll me, or if people are going to come to my account to argue with me anyway, you know, I'll respond to one, you know, tweet in response to my tweet that says something. And if I engage with that tweet and only that tweet, that one typically will rise to the top of the replies after my primary tweet. right, okay, that sounds, that might be hard to follow. And in fact, it might not actually behoove you to respond to a lot of these individual tweets at a time. And yeah, it kind of, I think, demonstrates or makes it clear to people that, like, yeah, your time is being wasted, and the trolls in some ways are succeeding, when they have all of these pieces of evidence. But so I guess kind of to support what everybody else is saying, and to demonstrate this very concrete version of how I see people deal with that. But the sort of idea of, like, are you wasting your time, I think can be helpful.
Yeah. Sorry, this is not related to that, but jumping back to the previous point, I do often think also about, again, not just like my audience, and I'm not a journalist, I'm an activist, right? But I think about it even just going back to like school bullying or something like that, where sometimes it's less about how you're responding to the bully and more about like what other people are seeing, right? And so for me, I recognize, like, I have a solid job. I'm not going to get fired from my job because people are harassing me on Twitter. I have a support network in my life. And so sometimes responding, and especially responding in kind of a like F you sort of way, is less for myself or the troll and more for like the young trans women who follow me, who like see that it's not getting to me, and then I'm just like, whatever, who cares about these people's opinion, and sort of like, so just, and also the followers of the people who are harassing me, who are seeing that it's not working, or also that like, or you also think about the person who's just kind of like an onlooker being like, ooh, and like having other people back you up can be a way that that person's like, oh, maybe that wasn't okay, right? And so I think just thinking about not even just your own audience, but also just like that sometimes responding to harassment, or particularly responding to someone harassing someone else, sometimes isn't about that person or the person doing the harassment. It's about like everyone else who's watching, right? And about like, setting norms of like what is and isn't okay in our culture. So just wanted to say that.
I love that, Evan. Thank you for saying all of that. And I think, as horrible as it can be on the internet, it is so inspiring to see people, the creativity and the humanity and the warmth and of people, smart people, thoughtful people, responding like that, or like there was some posts I saw recently in response to, it's like, it's so hard to keep up of all of the horrible anti-trans turfy stuff that's going on every single day. But someone kind of saying, I think it was about the Margaret Atwood thing, not a reaction, but a larger response of like, wow, she just does not get it. And like, just focusing on like, kind of just ignore all this, like what, this is irrelevant. Like these people, I mean, not to say like, we're just gonna pretend this isn't happening, because it is happening and we need to address it because it's so horrible, but kind of saying like, we need to get on with our lives, and like what we want to focus on is, I don't know, the positive, or no, I'm not being very articulate. Whoever this person was who their post was so great. It was just so inspiring. But again, kind of rising above and also, like taking leadership in how to engage online, and having standards of engagement, and things like respect and kindness and dignity. So thank you for saying that.
Oh, wait, also really quickly, actually kind of thinking about what Evan was saying, I absolutely love it when like a bigger creator will then argue with the trolls of another person, like a smaller creator. And then you see this really satisfying, like the troll has 3 likes on their tweet, and then the response of the bigger creator that's just like totally owning them has like 300 likes on their tweet. And it feels really, really good to see something like that. So I think, yeah, in a lot of ways, like I really do love it when people, feed the trolls and rally around like that.
That's nice. Yeah. Okay, let's see. I had all these like pre-prepared questions that it seems like we've actually already answered. Although, Sharif, do you have other things to say about kind of newsrooms and publishers addressing online abuse, or, do you think that writers and journalists have the support that they need? Can you say a little bit more about that?
I think there needs to be more, and I think that we need to be conscious of the fact that the trolling itself isn't the only mental burden on journalists. I mean, as you were describing, there is so much just in culture right now that constitutes harassment, even if it's not directed toward that individual reporter. And so in the context of all of that, getting hate directed at you is just another mental burden. I think we need to have newsrooms in which editors understand that and make it known that the reporter should come to them and just say, I'm stressed out. I shouldn't do this assignment right now. I need a break from doing X or Y or Z. And to have their reporters know that their editors are going to be accommodating and look for solutions rather than look for filling a widget position, right? Or getting a story filed should not be the priority over the kind of culture that they want to create in newsrooms. That is something that I adhere to. I only want to work for bosses that adhere to that as well. But we need to have more conversations about that in newsrooms, that if we want to build a culture in which we're doing the kind of work that we want to do, that we need to be supportive of the people that we're bringing into newsrooms, and particularly when we're trying to improve our diversity in newsrooms. That means we need to listen to the diverse people who we're bringing in newsrooms and understand that they're going to have different experiences and different reactions to the kinds of things that we face. If we look at the person who was typically running a newsroom 10 or 15 years ago, they had more resources to deal with the harassment that they faced than the people that they are trying to attract into newsrooms now. And we need to be conscious of the fact that, therefore, there would be different reactions from those people.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Sheree.
I have actually seen, when I've talked to a few journalists about the resources in their newsrooms, they sometimes say, I don't actually know. I haven't really checked yet. And so I've seen it in some cases, editors proactively say, like in weekly or every other weekly meeting, like, hey, how is everybody? Right. And giving people like a prompt to be able to say things so that the burden doesn't have to necessarily be on people to come forward to be like, hey, I'm being bothered, but to like have that norm be more present of like, okay, we are actively watching out for you. And so I like the idea of, editors being really proactive and signaling like, we will do whatever we can to support you.
Thanks,
I would just quickly add to that, like, you can be proactive even before things start. Like, just say, like, one thing we do with Fight for the Future is like, we recognize our email list has people from all across the political spectrum on it. And we know that when we send an email about ICE surveillance, we're going to get a ton of racist responses from like right-wingers who maybe care about the surveillance work that we do, but are pro-ICE. And so we like, before we send that email, just kind of like recognize that, prepare ourselves, think about who's like checking the inbox, and maybe think about like not having it be a person for whom those responses are going to like really hit, right? And so just like thinking about before you publish a story that might lead to significant trolling, having some awareness about that, and like even just like, before it starts, making it clear that you've got folks back, or putting a plan in place for like who's going to kind of field the incoming, and who might maybe shouldn't have to.
Thanks, Evan. Thank you, guys. We have tons of great questions in the chat. So let me jump into a couple of them. And let's see. Here, here's from Emmett. For a small organization that only has the capacity to invest in one thing regarding digital security, what should we prioritize? Lee, do you want to maybe take that?
Free password manager, Bitwarden, get everybody using it. Even the like enterprisey organization features are quite inexpensive. Really a huge fan. It's a good product. I think that's like, if I had to restrict myself to one thing, getting everybody using a password manager is the one thing.
Thank you. You've given me that advice and it's still on my to-do list. So terrible.
Ah! We'll get you there. We'll get
you. Okay, here's another good one. I'm going to type this into the chat from Sean. When should organizations know when to issue a statement of support or just not to engage? On this kind of trolling, I think this came in. Is the advice the organization or others should respond and not the targeted individual, right? So should it be that, I guess, kind of on the journalist's example or the organization example, like that the response should come from the organization rather than the individual? Do one of you want to respond to that?
I think the biggest one for me in that regard is, are the people that are going after the individual is part of the rhetoric that you're seeing from folks targeting one of your journalists? Is it focused on like, news outlets should fire this person? If you see that kind of rhetoric, it is absolutely essential for the outlet to come forward and say, like, we're not going to fire this person. We stand behind their work. That is like the one case where I think it's like super clear cut. If you're concerned about it escalating to that kind of behavior, if it's a particular group of threat actors who that is their standard playbook, you may want to do it preemptively. But if it's already gone there, that's where it's like the most.
Yeah, I think one other potential consideration is kind of a Streisand effect, is if your organization is making a statement, will it actually direct more attention and harassment to people who aren't looking at that particular article or something like that?
That's a really good point. So that's got to be case by case evaluation. I think so many of these questions here seem like they're in Lee, in your ballpark. So let's see, here's one. How do you account for indirect security and privacy liabilities that might be out of your control? For example, my mom is a prolific user of Facebook, and the sheer amount of information she's put on there would easily be enough to dox both her and myself.
I think that's a really tough one. I think, Evan, it sounded like you had some thoughts.
Yeah, I can chat. I mean, I've had this exact challenge come up, and it's good to remember like what your threat model is. Like when Fight for the Future was the target of a sustained phishing campaign that I mentioned, they went after all of our partners and like tried to phish our partners because they correctly assumed that some of our partners maybe didn't have their accounts quite as well locked down as we did. And I think partly this is like can be a more of like a relational thing. And like, it is about talking to the people in your life about the ways in which their behavior could put you at risk. And that, that can be a challenging conversation to have. I think, this also speaks to like broader culture around digital security. And, like Jenny, you just sort of mentioned this, like we can often feel like some shame or like feel overwhelmed or like, and I think that often gets people to shut down. Like they kind of feel like, oh, like I haven't done this for so long, like, and I'm a bad person because I didn't do it. And then like that can stop us from like taking the first step. But, like Lee mentioned, like if you just set up a password manager, you're already like 1,000% safer than you were yesterday. And then if you turn on two-factor authentication, you're probably like 10,000% safer than you were yesterday. And so like there's very small steps that like you and your family members can take. And I think just like, trying to move people away, I don't think shaming is a good way to move people. I think it's really more about like inviting, but also like being real with people. Like if you're genuinely worried, like I have had conversations that I thought wouldn't go as well as they did go much better than they did. And people tend to be more motivated by the worry that their behavior could harm someone else than themselves. So even if they're like, well, I don't have anything to hide, blah, 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 explaining to them that like what they are doing could put you at risk or put others at risk can sometimes be very helpful in motivating people to take basic precautions. And then beyond that, I mean, there are, even with Facebook, being Facebook, like just encouraging to make sure like your mom is like, has on even just basic things like not having posts be public, but only seen by friends. That's not going to like protect against all types of threats, but like it does make it harder for just like a sort of low level troll to like find their account, then find you, like download some photos or whatever. And it's good to remember that like a lot of what we're dealing with is low level trolls who are not going to take the time and or do not have the sophistication to like, hack your account. And so like just those very basic types of precautions can actually make a really big difference.
Thanks, Evan. Sharif, did you have something to say? Or am I maybe not?
No, I think we moved on from what I was going to jump in on, so we're good.
Well, actually, sorry, I'm jumping in. Dawn had a really good question, and Sharif, it looked like maybe you were willing to jump in on Dawn's question. Dawn's question was, what's your advice when trolls and opponents conflate journalism with doxing? And then there's a detailed case study, but do you think are you able to talk about that?
Yeah, I'm happy. And I think part of the problem is that we don't explain what journalism is as an industry, and we don't do it as organizations. And so when we see situations like this, there's an opportunity to write a personal piece explaining what we're doing and why we're doing it, and what values we're trying to uphold by doing it, to distinguish it from doxing. People understand doxing based on what they have seen on social themselves, as opposed to making a journalistic argument for putting particular information out. And so I think that's where that's going to come from.
Thanks. Okay, let's see. Here's another good one. What mental health support do you think media organizations should give to staff and freelancers experiencing online abuse? Any, I guess, Lee, too?
I think that having a quality EAP in place is really essential. There's a lot of variability across these programs, ranging from like, we'll send you a list of therapists and you have to call them, to really customizable in-depth services that provide a number of counseling sessions, not just like 3. So really shopping around as an organization to get good coverage, in addition to whatever is covered through your actual like mental health coverage of your standard like healthcare, which is the whole other thing, but potentially even working with your EAP program to give them some context that like these are journalists, and maybe having a lot of the EAPs have the ability to have sort of custom content for the therapists that they work with, to say like, hey, this is a journalism organization, here's some things that you might want to know about. Being on social media is part of their job. You can't just tell them to stop using the internet, that kind of thing. I think there's also a really strong opportunity for sort of peer support. One of the things we know about how trauma works and how adverse events, adverse experiences either do or don't cause long-term harm is that having social support is really critical. So whether that's like a structured, facilitated support group kind of function, I think there's actually a lot of opportunity for it sounds cheesy this is my like horrible startup person. There's like a lot of opportunity for innovation in this space, but I think there really is within organizations to say like, hey, let's get a counselor to do a session once every couple of weeks where folks can just talk this stuff through.
And I'd add, while it's not therapy, I mean, the reason you have organizations like NLGA, TJA, the National Association of Black Journalists, is for peers to kind of share information and share how they're coping.
Yeah, I think, and on top of that as well, is like thinking with like maybe diversity and inclusion training and programs, is articulating to colleagues, like, especially like white colleagues or male colleagues, like what does harassment look like and how does it disproportionately affect like, queer, POC, other, folks on your team? Because I think a lot of people, just white cis dudes, I don't know, don't actually understand the extent to how different the experience of harassment looks like online for marginalized folks.
One quick thing I would add, and this is sort of like, I don't know, almost seems like a little flippant or obvious, but like, it's important to remember that like harassment lands differently depending on what else is going on in your life. And like,
So like one thing I would say that helps your staff deal with harassment, pay them well. Make sure that they like can afford to live in a sweet house and like have some basic security. Like make sure they have good health care. You know, it's easier to deal with online harassment when you're not also like struggling financially or, you know, other things that are going on in your life. And so I think just recognizing that like these things don't happen in a vacuum. And, you know, that like just generally being an institution that takes care of your employees and makes them feel valued and backed in a number of different ways will make a difference when they do inevitably face online harassment or other types of harassment for doing their jobs.
Thanks, Evan. That's a fantastic point. Yeah. Let's see. Ariel Fox has a question here. I'll type this in. Any help, resources, or comments when you are harassed within a community and the abuser using tactics to garner sympathy with platform mods or community leaders? How can I signpost the oblivious ? Allies of trolls? So yeah, help, resources, or comments when you're harassed within a community and the abuser using tactics to garner sympathy with the platform mods or community leaders. Any of you guys have a, Lee, you are unmuted, is that?
It's just it's a really tough question, and I unmuted myself to like force myself to think about it. I think the couple of things that I've seen work in situations like that, which I've definitely seen that kind of situation. One is reconnect with the organization's values, identify how this abusive person that's trying to garner sympathy from like folks within the organization may be acting in ways which are counter to the organization's values, and to reconnecting with your personal values. This sounds like very sort of nebulous, but it's really like, so many of us have seen the language of social justice misused to engage in abusive behavior. And the only way that I've seen of like systematically countering that kind of misuse is to stay connected with your values. So I know that's like a very meta answer to a very concrete scenario, but hopefully it's at least a little helpful.
I think one practical, this is so tough. One practical way that I've seen people manage it is, well, one, you kind of have to, on some level, collect evidence around when these things happen to you, and then having a sounding board of saying like presenting evidence to a sounding board person of like, hey, if I went to a moderator or community leader about this, do I sound crazy? And how can I articulate this in a way that, identifies, and in fact, maybe, your sounding board or your person will be like, oh, actually, there's kind of a vocabulary for this, or there's precedence for this. So that's like on a very like personal, practical level, that's what I've seen be very useful.
I'm totally cheating and jumping in, even though I'm not a panelist, but I want to add one note about that. I would say that if it's, for example, like if you're in a Facebook group or in some kind of group where there's moderators, write privately to the folks. If you know who the moderators are, honestly, in my experience, like private outreach, I'm not suggesting you write privately to trolls. I generally do not consider that to be very effective or a good idea. Although some folks have told me how they've done that and actually established relationships, and I'm in support of whatever people want to do individually to empower themselves. But if it's the moderators you're concerned about that you think are being turned against you in deliberately abusive ways or inadvertently contributing to your abuse, write them a private note and explain, like, these are the things that are happening to me. Here's some screenshots. This is how it feels for me to experience this. And I would really appreciate if you could be an ally. And I'm actually going to drop a few links that are guidance to other people on how to be good allies. And I think Sharif dropped something good in the chat too. And just send them that link and be like, if you like, this is how you can be an ally to folks who are facing online abuse instead of inadvertently contributing to it. Not in exactly that language, but something along that line could also help. Sorry, I cheated and jumped in. I'll turn my video back on.
Thank you for jumping in, Victoria. Very helpful. Let's see. Here's another question from Sean. And this maybe Sharif, you might have some ideas here. Who should newsrooms call if they want to do more organizationally? I wonder, well, I'm curious if NLGJA or TJA have resources in that regard, or
one I can at least, is actually the reference I dropped in the chat. The PowerShift project, which was formed, I think, about 3 years ago, delivers training that makes newsrooms basically places where there is less harassment, and places where people, particularly marginalized people, are more empowered. And they take specific scenarios out of newsrooms to do the training. So it's not generalized anti-harassment training. It is training that is designed for journalists to relate to the scenarios. It is very inclusive training. The organizer of the project, Jill Geisler, reached out to NABJ, reached out to NLGJ, reached out to a number of organizations in creating the scenarios that are being taught. And they also have a separate training for allies, which is what I dropped in the chat, of how to recognize these signs that people are being harassed in the workplace. So it can be workplace harassment that is within a newsroom, or signs that things are happening outside. And if you get a person from your organization into training, they have a train the trainer program. And the goal is to send people back to newsrooms, send people to other situations in which they can train newsrooms to be places in which people are going to step up, to be places in which if you have a Matt Lauer situation in your newsroom, people are going to speak up and not be quiet. That's a huge resource that newsrooms should have.
Thanks, Sharif. And actually, just to say, PEN America is also a huge resource, and I think Victoria specifically just posted something in the chat. So looks like we have 5 minutes left, and let me just do one more question here, and then we can do some wrap-ups. What responsibility do journalists have in protecting sources they've quoted, and are there resources for newsrooms and freelancers to aid in training on this? I guess that's kind of a Sharif and/or Victoria. Protecting sources. Do you have any? Or is that
yeah. I mean, that's the bread and butter of news organizations, and it depends on the pledge and promise that you've made to your source. And I think a key is to not overpromise, to not promise something to a source that you can't deliver, and to make it clear to those sources that, hey, I'm asking you to be named in this story. That means that people are going to see the story and that they may reach out to you. And these are the implications of that. And that there are some things that we can control and we can negotiate. And there are other things that we're not in the place that we can control, and that you need to be able to make a decision about that. What would be problematic would be hiding information that you know that people are going to face if they're in the context of your story, if they are being served to your audience, which may be an audience that would see that your source is problematic. The key is disclosure and letting people make an autonomous decision based on having the information that they need to make that decision.
Okay.
The one other thing I'd add is I've actually talked to reporters a lot about this. One of the things that reporters have told me really upsets them and disturbs them is that when their own newsrooms have comments at the bottom of articles, to see people quoted in their stories, especially if they're minors or if they're, they've experienced trauma in some way, to see folks abused in the comments. And that actually, I think, is frankly a failure of media organizations to moderate comments. I know it's hard, but either don't have comments or come up with systems to moderate comments, or at the very least put policies at the top of comment threads that say, like, this isn't what we're not going to tolerate. Because there is some responsibility to not allow a total free-for-all in the comments that is both abusive against reporters and abusive against people quoted and sources, et cetera. So that's a small thing, but I would point that out. And I mean, it seems like I wouldn't necessarily end on that for our whole session, but it's just something I wanted to jump in and share. And Sharif, I totally agree with everything you just said too.
Yeah, actually with the comments one, I feel like some really good practical stuff is like, okay, choose the articles that you're going to have the comments open for. and then have set time periods that you're allowing the comments to actually be posted. So you're like, okay, we're closing the comments for this one now, so now we don't have to worry about our moderators. So yeah, I think being really deliberate about your comments policy and having like a protocol where like, yeah, we can't cover all of these articles. So these are the articles we want comments on, and we're going to have the resources for those, I think is really helpful.
Can I jump in and ask a question, Jenny, or do you have a last question that you want to ask?
No, go for it.
So that's something I've been thinking so much about is how we as a kind of, and I pose this to all of our panelists and like truly in the spirit of inquiry myself, how we shift the culture from the sense that, and I think Evan talked about this book before, from the sense that this is an individual problem that people have to somehow like come up with crazy cockeyed schemes to protect themselves, to the understanding that this is a social problem that mirrors patriarchy and racism and everything else that are kind of issues that we have in society at large, but that are amplified by the realities of how these platforms prioritize and surface content. And so I think if anyone has thoughts on how we shift the culture to talk about this as a systemic problem, not an individual, just self-defense problem, I would really love to hear from everyone, because it's something I think a lot about.
Oh my gosh, I have so many things to say about that. If I can, I'll just quickly add that I completely agree with that. And I would add on top of that I think we need to move beyond acting like this is a problem that is new and was created by the existence of these platforms and one that they can solve, right? And that the only reason that it hasn't gone away is just that like they just don't care, right? Because I think we need to be able to separate the genuine tensions and complexities of engaging in content moderation at the scale of billions of people's speech from like the actual design and choices that these companies are making that are often perhaps exacerbating what is not, as you just said, Victoria, a new problem, but rather a problem that has been part of our like deeply white supremacist, misogynist, patriarchal, transphobic culture for like a long time that is now, and I think we need to learn how to separate like what is a new problem that's actually genuinely being created by the existence of social media. Of those problems, which ones can be solved without creating even worse problems, right? Which is a piece that people often leave out of this. And then, which are problems that are inherent to technology that basically allows, billions of people to speak, which I would argue those problems maybe are not worth solving, that actually the benefit of having, exponentially more people be able to have a voice is worth some of the messiness that comes with it. But then which problems are being driven by specific business choices, like algorithmic manipulation that's driven by surveillance, right? And that's why, and I, Lee, you led with this, but I would completely agree that in terms of the policy choices we have in front of us, like the US doesn't have a data privacy law. So like, we've got politicians who are over here talking about, ripping up Section 230 or banning online anonymity, things that have been roundly condemned by human rights organizations around the world as something that would actually do much more harm than good. And we don't even have a basic law in place that governs how corporations can collect your data and use it to manipulate. So I would argue that, in terms of policy interventions at a legislative level, let's start with getting a basic data privacy law in place, hopefully a good one, but even just like a mediocre one, I would like live with. And then, let's see where we can push on the platforms to do better, right? And generally speaking, I feel like often when we push on the platforms, we're working the refs in a game that we always lose, or a game that's rigged, right? But I do think there are specific types of changes that we can push for the platforms to make that will make an immediate difference and reduce harm. But I think in the end, we do need to start like separating out and like asking the right questions in order to get the right answers. Because when, right now, a lot of the mainstream conversation around this is sort of conflating the internet or social media broadly with Facebook, basically, and, or perhaps Facebook and YouTube, which are platforms that have made very specific design and business model decisions that I would argue are sort of fundamentally incompatible with basic human rights and democracy. And I think we need to start separating out the genuine concerns with those platforms and their business practices from what frankly is also a lot of elite hand-wringing about the fact that we're never going back to a world where information can be easily controlled. And I think separating those things out helps us lead toward real solutions.
Thanks, Evan. I'm very grateful for that big picture framing, and so important to put it all in context. We are at time, we're over time. And I just want to thank all of our panelists and Pan America and NLGJA and TJA, and want to encourage everyone to come back for our next panel on November 9th on online abuse and self-defense training. And I just put a link in the chat. Go register now. And thanks to everyone. Victoria, do you have any final words?
Just a warm thanks to all of our wonderful audience and panelists. And Jenny was a terrific moderator. Thank you all so much, and take good care of yourselves.
Thank you all.